Steffi's heart pounded in her ears as she raced across the cracked concrete floor of the abandoned warehouse, every instinct screaming that she was too late for Ms. Dillon. Hayes's devoted art teacher, who had vanished days earlier after staying late to prepare her lesson plans by the dim glow of her laptop. The fluorescent lights above flickered as she slipped through rows of rusted shelving, following the echo of her own footsteps and the faint, muffled cries that had driven her here. She found Ms. Dillon bound to a chair at the far end of the cavernous space, ropes cutting into the woman's wrists, her mouth gagged with a twisted strip of duct tape. Relief surged through Steffi until she spotted the small vial dangling around Dillon's neck, the ominous ticking of its hidden timer marking the seconds until an untraceable neurotoxin would render Dillon unconscious forever. Drawing closer, Steffi felt a sudden sting at the back of her neck, a silvery dart burying itself painlessly into her flesh. She staggered, vision blurring, arms dropped to her sides as her knees buckled, and every protest of her body dissolved into darkness. When Steffi awoke, the stench of chemicals burned her nostrils and seared her lungs, acrid, sour, unmistakably lethal. Her arms were secured behind her back with leather straps, her ankles shackled to a steel beam beneath the catwalk above. Across the dimly lit expanse of the warehouse floor, she saw the chemical vats, massive, cylindrical tanks filled with bubbling, greenish liquid that hissed and spat as though hungry for flesh. Her breath caught when she spotted a rope descending from the ceiling, at its end a simple wooden harness holding a tiny figure, so still her mind refused to register it as her son. Then her vision cleared and she saw Hayes's toe wriggle and his head slump forward, Luna's handiwork. Above him, the rope passed over a pulley attached to a steel girder. Below, a digital countdown clock glowed red, 30 minutes. And at the base of that bat, ready to catch him in a silent grave of acid, lay the truth of Luna's monstrosity. She had returned, not as the broken victim she once played, but as the puppeteer of Steffi's worst nightmares. At the center of the catwalk, Luna stood in the pool of harsh white light cast by a single spotlight, her calm smile as chilling as the moon outside. In her hand she held the remote detonator for the dart gun, each press a promise of instant anesthesia, and with her other hand she toyed with a length of rope tethered to a platform where Ms. Dillon sat, now silent in her chair, eyes wide with recognition and fear. Luna's voice rang out, clear and deliciously cruel. "Welcome, Steffi. I'm so glad you could join us. Please don't speak. Save that for your hourly confession. First, you'll rescue Ms. Dillon, unbind her, and then we'll move on to the real game, your son's life or hers." Her tone turned sweet as she pressed a hand to her heart. "You see, Ms. Dillon taught Hayes to create beauty. I intend to teach him sacrifice." Steffi's stomach lurched, ball rising as she struggled against the straps, every muscle screaming in protest. "Let him down, Luna," she rasped, voice cracking, "or I swear I will." Luna cut her off with a single, mocking clap that echoed through the rafters. "Oh, Steffi. Always so dramatic. You have 30 minutes to make your choice. Every second that clock ticks down brings you closer to the moment when I'll pull the lever and Mr. Darcy's daughter will learn what it feels like to taste her own demise. But don't worry, I'll be watching. Every tear you shed, every plead you utter, I'll be right here, reminding Hayes that his real mother chose to let someone else fall." Steffi's vision swam with tears as she forced herself to look up at her son's pale face, framed by the crude wooden contraption that kept him aloft. Even unconscious, Hayes's chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. The realization that no dozen she had once given him for nightmares had been replaced by the very chemical that now threatened to engulf him drove her to frantic pleading against her bonds. Lowering her head, she pressed her lips to the dusty floorboards and whispered, "Hayes, baby, I'm coming," but the words were swallowed by the cavernous room. She flexed her wrists until her fingertips scraped against the coarse steel, a futile effort, but enough to draw Luna's attention. "You're welcome to try," Luna taunted, stepping back so that the spotlight illuminated her shadow against the bulkhead. "But remember, this warehouse is soundproofed and locked from the outside. No one hears your screams but me. Now, do you unbind Miss Dillon and deliver the key to my taunting voice, or do you do nothing and watch your son become fossilized?" She raised the remote, clicking it to fire a soft, zinging shot. A warning dart embedded itself in Steffy's shoulder, sending a pulse of cold through her spine. She staggered forward, pain blossoming in her arm, but her eyes never left Hayes. 45 seconds on the timer. Steffy shouted through the gag in Dylan's mouth, dancing on the edge of consciousness. Her mind raced. Free Miss Dillon first, or try to reach Hayes's harness. The ropes above were thick but twisted tight around the pulleys. She could slip away from her straps if she managed to collapse her arms inward, but the dizziness threatened to drag her back into oblivion. Seconds ticked away. Luna's smile widened. "Time is a precious thing, Steffy, for you. Its meaning is clear. For Hayes, it's the breath he holds. Choose wisely." In a moment of desperation that felt like madness, Steffy gave a guttural cry and shifted her weight, ripping the leather strap from its mounting bolt with a sound like tearing flesh. Pain exploded in her shoulder, but adrenaline surged through her veins, sharpening her focus like a scalpel. She forced her right arm backward, freeing her hand, and turned to slice at Dylan's bonds with a shard of broken glass she kept hidden at her ankle. Within seconds, the ropes fell away and Dylan collapsed against Steffy's unbound wrist. Without a word, Steffy yanked off Dylan's gag. "Run!" she hissed, but Dylan's eyes darted to the vat, horror rooting her to the spot as the timer counted down to 20 seconds. Steffy ripped off Dylan's hands and shoved her toward a rusted ladder against the far wall. "You need to get help. Get the fire department. The police." She didn't finish because the countdown had reached 10. The rope above Hayes creaked ominously. Steffy leapt forward, grabbing the dangling rope with both hands, then climbed the rungs fashioned from scaffolding like a catavat. The chemical vat hissed louder as though sensing its prey. At 5 seconds, Steffy felt the platform shift as her weight threatened to yank Hayes upward. She wrapped one hand around his harness and the other around the rope, bracing herself. "Choose, Steffy." Luna's voice cracked with laughter. 2 seconds, 3. Steffy's vision narrowed to her son's face and the single decision that would define her soul. She glanced down at Dylan, still shaking on the ladder, and back up at the silent face of Hayes. Then, with every ounce of resolve in her being, she whispered, "I choose you," and swung into motion, catching the beam that held the pulley and yanking it free from its bracket. Steel screeched as it tore from the ceiling, and Hayes dropped, briefly free from chemical doom, into Steffy's arms as she hung by one hand, the vat no longer a pit but a pitiless mirror to her triumph and her terror. The countdown clock shattered against the concrete as its wires sparked, the timer frozen at midnight. Behind her, the sound of sirens filled the warehouse as Dylan had raced for help, and Finn and Ridge burst through the side door, guns drawn but lowered in astonishment as they saw Steffy's arms wrapped around Hayes, her face slick with tears and sweat. Luna, backing away into the shadows, hissed, "This isn't over. Miss Sunshine will return," but Ridge lunged forward, slamming her to the floor and clamping handcuffs on her wrists before she could vanish again. Chicago Blackhawk-style steel grated as the rescue team secured the perimeter, and Steffy dropped to her knees, cradling Hayes to her chest, pressing her cheek to his small head. Hayes stirred, blinking up at her with tear-streaked cheeks, breath coming in ragged sobs as he whispered, "Mama." Steffy kissed his forehead so fiercely she tasted her own tears and murmured, "I'll always choose you," her voice a vow sealed in the echoing hollow of the warehouse. Miss Dillon hugged them both, trembling, and Finn held them close as the lights of the arriving ambulance bathed them in red and white relief. The game Luna set in motion had ended in defiance and love, but as Steffi looked at the rope still swinging from the broken pulley and at the stained paper fortune teller fluttering on the steel beam above, she knew the scars of this night, of forced choices and chemical threats, would mark their souls forever, a reminder that the darkest games could be won only with the fiercest love. Hayes emerged from the ordeal of his kidnapping alive, but irrevocably changed, a silent observer in a world that had once sung to him in lullabies and sunlight. In the weeks following his rescue, every flicker of evening light became a gauntlet of terror, curtains drawn too tightly against the dusk, shadows gathering at the corners of his vision. And the sudden dimming of a lamp sent him into a convulsive shudder that no comfort could still. Steffi and Finn watched helplessly as their once gregarious boy recoiled from even the gentlest embrace when night approached, flinching at the softness of his mother's hand or the warmth of his father's voice. He barricaded his nursery in a fortress of plush toys and night lights set on every shelf, 1,000 tiny beacons that fought back the darkness just enough to keep him breathing. But even so, he refused to speak. His lips parted in silent cries, tears coursing down his cheeks as though the words themselves were monsters he could never utter. Months stretched on like an endless eclipse, and in the hush of his trauma, a new obsession took root: origami. Sheets of paper folded into cranes and swans, boats and stars, crowded the edges of his bed, the shelves of his playroom, and eventually spilled into the hallways of his childhood home. At first, the delicate art seemed a balm. His small fingers coaxing flat squares into living forms, each crease a concession of control in a world that had betrayed him. But over time, the paper menagerie grew darker. The wings of his cranes bent at unnatural angles, their necks twisted as though in silent screams, black ink daubs staining their centers like bleeding wounds. Finn once found him late at night, crouched beneath the windowsill, folding a paper swan as the moonlight slipped through the glass. His face was solemn, his eyes unblinking, and the swan's folded beak held a single word scrawled in graphite: remember. Steffi recognized the message. It was the same one Luna had scrawled across the origami left in her own driveway the night she abducted Hayes, but the sight of her son echoing his captor's gestures hollowed out her heart. The origami burst across every surface of Rupert Art School, where Hayes had once sketched watercolors of sunflowers and danced through finger paint sessions with ease. Now the halls were littered with pale paper shapes, swans on the reception desk, cranes perched on the tops of easels, papier-mâché dragons coiled among charcoal sketches. Teachers whispered about the origami incident, the day Hayes swept every desk clear, arranging 800 identical paper stars in a perfect grid across the classroom floor, insisting they were the watchers. His classmates spoke in hushed tones of the boy who refused to speak, but whose eyes glittered with a knowledge beyond his years, as though the lines of geometry in his folds foretold some dark symphony. Beneath the surface of childish fascination, steely threads of menace wove through his creations. Each pattern followed the same ominous sequence, a code that Finn and Steffi could not crack but felt in their bones. At home, Hayes hid beneath covers, folding his origami by dim flashlight, whispering numbers in a breathless cadence, 3, 6, 2, 1, as though chanting an incantation. When Steffi found the scraps of paper in his pockets, each bearing the symbol of a swan dripping ink, her stomach clenched. He had begun leaving his art in places where it would terrify the unwary, a star pinned under the teacher's chair, cranes suspended in the doorway to the lunchroom, swans floating in the koi pond under the art school's courtyard. Rumors spread of children startled into tears by the silent paper shapes of frightened parents who discovered swans folded into their mailboxes. The media picked up the story with lurid enthusiasm. Traumatized third-gen Forrester Air haunts school with origami haunting, the headlines screamed, painting Hayes as a spectral force rather than a boy in need of love and care. In private, Finn and Steffy faced a horror beyond the confines of therapy sessions. The fear that their son, crushed by trauma and manipulated by Luna's insidious methods, was being shaped into a villain for his own generation. They watched him at the dinner table, jaw clenched, folding napkins into sharp-pointed boats that floated on his half-eaten soup. They discovered him in his bedroom at dawn, arraying hundreds of fiery orange cranes in a spiral on the floor as a pale sun rose through the curtains. Friends urged them to transfer Hayes to a specialized school or to enroll him in boarding, but every suggestion felt like abandonment. Another fracture in the shattered bonds of a family already stretched to its breaking point. At the same time, Luna's presence loomed in the shadows of Hayes' psyche. Even after her escape from custody, she seemed to speak through him, to guide his hands as they moved with supernatural precision. Confidential police reports leaked that Luna had left a trail of origami puzzles at her last hideout, riddles that authorities could not decipher, hints at some grand design aimed at eroding the Forrester legacy, one generation at a time. Now, Hayes' own origami reflected those same cryptic designs, as though he were finishing a blueprint Luna had begun. Steffi found herself standing in the nursery at midnight, staring at the wall covered in paper cranes, tears blurring her vision as she heard the faint rustle of wings against paint. "Hayes," she whispered, voice raw, but there was no reply, only the whisper of paper shifting in the draft. Finn's hands shook as he picked up a single crane, its wings stained a sinister red where Hayes had dabbed marker. They took the papers to experts in pattern analysis and behavioral psychology. Graphologists, codebreakers, forensic artists. Yet every interpretation led to darker corners of Hayes' fractured mind, a young boy conceptualizing control through art, envisioning himself as the master of a silent army of paper creatures. In one urgent meeting, a psychologist warned Finn and Steffi that unaddressed, Hayes' fixation could crystallize into antisocial behavior or obsessive-compulsive syndromes that might spiral into violent acts. "He's mapping his trauma onto his art," she said, voice low. "If we don't intervene, he could become the puppet he believes Luna wants him to be, or worse, the villain he's beginning to imagine." The words shattered Finn's composure. He looked at Steffi, whose usually fierce resolve dissolved into fear. They knew that the path ahead would require more than therapy. It would demand a reclamation of Hayes' identity before origami became his legacy. They met with Ridge and Taylor in hushed sessions beneath the arches of Forrester Manor, unspooling the harrowing tale of the boy's silent descent. Taylor closed her eyes, heartbreaking as she pictured the grandson she adored building weapons out of folded paper. Ridge, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, laid a hand on Finn's shoulder. "We will protect him. We will fight this darkness." The family rallied to devise a plan. A triangulation of art therapy, family immersion, and a structured routine that would gradually replace the rituals of origami with new patterns: mud play in the garden, sculpting clay in the kiln, music sessions under the open sky. But every sunset brought fresh dread. Hayes would retreat to a corner, paper in hand, and the cycle would begin again. Then, one morning, as rain hammered the windows of the art studio, Steffi discovered Hayes in a trance at the foot of the grand staircase, a vast mandala of cranes and swans radiating from his tiny form. His face was expressionless, his eyes dark pools reflecting the storm outside. She knelt beside him, voice trembling as she called his name. He turned and spoke his first words in months, a single sentence delivered in a calm, hollow tone. "They're coming." In that instant, Steffi knew that the battle for Hayes' soul and future was no longer simply about healing past wounds. It was about confronting the specter of the Forrester heir who might one day rise as an architect of fear. The Forrester-Finnegan alliance shifted into overdrive. Security consultants roamed the campus. Teachers underwent training to recognize Hayes' signals. And psychologists drafted emergency protocols for any outbreak of his origami manifestation. Meanwhile, Finn and Steffy held forbidden workshops in the sunroom of their home, teaching Hayes the art of sketching landscapes, of molding clay into gentle shapes, of writing letters to Luna. Letters he would never send, but that allowed him to externalize the maze of trauma folding itself into his mind. Some breakthroughs came in whispers. The day he painted a single sunlit horizon on an enormous canvas. The afternoon he tenderly folded a single paper flower rather than a swan. But in the deepest dusk, when shadows lengthened and the night lights flickered, he would still summon his origami army, each fold a heartbreak to his parents, each crease a reminder that Luna's legacy of manipulation might yet eclipse his innocence. The creative team behind Hayes' story began to hint at future episodes in which the boys' struggle between light and darkness would intensify. A path that might see him wrestle with Luna's ghostly influence, negotiate alliances with other troubled youths at the art school, and eventually confront the choice between embracing a destiny shaped by trauma or forging a new legacy of resilience. Early teasers for the season's climax whispered of a showdown in the school's grand atrium, where thousands of folded paper creations would animate under eerie blacklight, and Hayes would stand at the epicenter, torn between destroying those who loved him and saving himself from the origami prison of his mind. As viewers braced for the unfolding drama, one question loomed over Los Angeles and beyond. Could a child who had been weaponized by paper and fear be rescued in time from becoming the third generation's Dark Herald? Or would the silent boy who refused to speak become the most dangerous villain the Forrester name had ever known? In the quiet aftermath of each production meeting, the writers pressed forward, determined to navigate Hayes' journey with compassion and unflinching honesty, to show that even amidst the fragile beauty of folded paper, the human heart could find a way out of its own origami nightmares, and that the legacy of a Forrester might yet be redeemed by love stronger than any crease.